Autonomic nervous system reset. Daily prayer produces measurable changes in heart rate variability, a biomarker that reflects the balance between your sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. Studies using HRV monitoring show that individuals who engage in structured prayer practices, particularly those involving rhythmic breathing or repeated phrases, demonstrate a shift toward parasympathetic dominance within 5 to 7 minutes. This isn't about feeling peaceful. It's about your vagus nerve, the primary nerve of your rest and digest system, getting activated in a way that lowers resting heart rate, reduces cortisol, and improves immune function. Research from the HeartMath Institute found that coherent heart rhythms during prayer states correlate with improved cognitive performance for up to 2 hours afterward. The mechanism is simple. When you slow your breathing and focus your attention during prayer, you're manually overriding your stress response. But here's the trade-off. If prayer becomes anxious or guilt-driven, it triggers the opposite effect, spiking cortisol instead of lowering it. The autonomic benefits require genuine focus, not rushed obligation. This is why contemplative traditions across Christianity emphasized quality over speed. Desert Fathers prayed fewer prayers, but with absolute attention. Modern neuroscience now confirms what they discovered 1,500 years ago. The nervous system responds to intentionality, not volume. Delayed gratification training. Prayer is one of the few daily practices that requires you to invest time with no immediate tangible return. You don't get instant feedback, no dopamine hit, no visible result. This makes it a rare form of delayed gratification exercise in a world optimized for instant rewards. Neuroscientists studying the prefrontal cortex, the brain region responsible for long-term planning and impulse control, have found that activities requiring sustained attention without immediate payoff strengthen this area over time. The famous marshmallow test, which measures a child's ability to resist eating one marshmallow to get two later, predicts success across multiple life domains. Prayer functions as an adult version of this test every single day. You're choosing the unseen over the immediate, the long-term over the urgent, and your brain adapts. Studies on monks who maintain daily prayer schedules show thickened gray matter in the prefrontal regions associated with self-control and decision-making. The evolutionary angle here is fascinating. Early human survival depended on the ability to delay consumption, storing food, waiting for harvests, planning for winter. Ritual practices like prayer may have been one of the cognitive tools that allowed humans to develop this capacity. But the trade-off is real. If your prayer practice becomes mechanical or coerced, you lose the cognitive benefit because the prefrontal cortex disengages. The discipline only builds strength when it's voluntary and purposeful. Identity reinforcement. From a behavioral psychology perspective, prayer functions as a daily identity statement. You are not just thinking about who you want to be, you are enacting it through repeated behavior. Social psychologist James Clear's research on habit formation shows that identity-based habits are far more durable than goal-based ones. Someone who says, "I am a person who prays," is more likely to maintain the practice than someone who says, "I want to pray more." Daily prayer is the behavioral evidence you present to yourself about your core identity. Christians who pray daily are not just asking for things. They are rehearsing their identity as people who acknowledge dependence, seek guidance, and orient themselves towards something beyond survival. This is why the early church tied prayer to specific times: morning, midday, evening. It wasn't legalism, it was identity architecture. Each prayer was a micro-commitment, reinforcing who they believed they were. Anthropologists studying religious communities across cultures have found that daily rituals are the strongest predictors of long-term religious retention, far stronger than belief statements or weekly services. The mechanism is simple. Behavior shapes identity more than belief does. You become what you repeatedly do. The trade-off? If prayer becomes performative, done to be seen, or to check a box, it actually weakens identity because you're now enacting hypocrisy instead of authenticity. The cognitive benefit requires internal alignment. Metacognitive development. Metacognition is thinking about your own thinking. It's the ability to step outside your immediate mental state and observe it from a distance. This is an exceptionally rare cognitive skill, and prayer is one of the few daily practices that trains it. When you pray, especially using structured forms like the Lord's Prayer or liturgical prayers, you're forced to articulate your desires, fears, and thoughts in language directed at another consciousness. This creates psychological distance. Instead of being trapped inside your emotions, you're now describing them to someone else. Psychologists call this cognitive reappraisal, and it's one of the most effective emotional regulation strategies known. Studies show that people who regularly engage in reflective practices, prayer, journaling, meditation, develop stronger metacognitive abilities over time. They can identify cognitive distortions faster, catch themselves in irrational thinking, and adjust course mid-thought. The historical record supports this. Augustine's Confessions is essentially a long prayer that became one of the first works of psychological introspection in Western literature. He was thinking about his thinking by directing it toward God. The same pattern appears in the Psalms, which are prayers that constantly question, examine, and redirect internal states. Modern cognitive behavioral therapy uses similar techniques, externalizing thoughts to examine them, but prayer has been doing this for millennia. The vulnerability here is that without honesty, prayer devolves into self-deception. If you're performing rather than examining, you lose the metacognitive benefit. Temporal distance from problems. When you pray about a problem, you're neurologically creating distance from it. This isn't mystical, it's how the brain processes time and perspective. Research in cognitive psychology shows that when people imagine themselves in the future or address a situation from a third-person perspective, they make better decisions. Prayer does both. You're speaking about your current situation as if you're outside of it, and you're often asking for future guidance or outcomes. This temporal and perspective shift activates different neural pathways than rumination, which keeps you locked in the present problem. A study published in Psychological Science found that self-distancing, referring to yourself in the third person, or imagining your situation from a distance, reduces emotional reactivity and improves problem solving. Prayer naturally incorporates this mechanism. You're not just stuck in, I'm overwhelmed. You're saying, God, I'm overwhelmed and I need wisdom. That linguistic shift creates cognitive breathing room. Historical Christianity understood this instinctively. The practice of exam, developed by Ignatius of Loyola, involved reviewing your day as if watching it from outside yourself, in conversation with God. This wasn't spiritual fluff. It was early cognitive reframing. The limitation? If prayer becomes catastrophizing or obsessive repetition of the same anxieties, you lose the distance. Instead of creating perspective, you're deepening the groove of worry. Pre-commitment device. In behavioral economics, a pre-commitment device is a choice you make now that restricts your future options to ensure better behavior. Ulysses tying himself to the mast to resist the sirens is the classic example. Daily prayer functions as a pre-commitment device for your values and decisions. When you pray in the morning about patience, integrity, or love, you're setting a future constraint. You've now verbally committed, which creates psychological friction against violating that commitment later in the day. Studies on public commitments show that people are far more likely to follow through on behavior they've stated aloud or written down. Prayer is a daily public commitment, public to God and often to yourself. It's why the practice of morning prayer across Christian traditions has always included confession and petition. You're not just asking for help, you're committing to a standard before the day's temptations arrive. The monastic tradition of the daily office structured entire days around these commitment points, prayers at set hours that recalibrated behavior before it could drift. Modern research on implementation intentions confirms this. People who decide, when X happens, I will do Y, are significantly more successful at behavior change than those who set vague goals. Prayer often follows this exact format. When I face the situation, help me respond this way. The downside is that if your prayers are generic or disconnected from real decisions, they lose their pre-commitment power. The mechanism requires specificity and honesty. Emotional regulation capacity. Prayer doesn't just calm you in the moment, it trains your capacity to regulate emotions over time. This is a crucial distinction. Emotional regulation isn't about suppressing feelings, it's about managing their intensity and duration. Neuroscientists studying the amygdala, the brain's emotional alarm system, have found that practices involving focused attention and emotional labeling reduce amygdala reactivity over time. When you pray, especially using confession or lament, you're engaging in emotional labeling, naming what you feel and why. This activates the prefrontal cortex, which has an inhibitory connection to the amygdala, literally dampening the intensity of the emotional response. A study from UCLA found that putting feelings into words affect labeling reduces emotional distress more effectively than distraction or suppression. Prayer is structured effect labeling directed toward a compassionate listener. The Psalms are a masterclass in this. Half of them are complaints, laments, and raw emotional expression, but they're directed, not vented. They move through the emotion rather than around it. Over time, this practice builds what psychologists call distress tolerance, the ability to experience difficult emotions without collapsing or avoiding them. The monks who prayed through the Psalms daily weren't just being religious, they were training their nervous systems to handle fear, grief, and anger without being controlled by them. The trade-off is that prayer can become emotional avoidance if used to bypass, rather than process, difficult feelings. "I'll just pray about it" can be healthy surrender or unhealthy denial, depending on how it's used. Default mode network activation. The default mode network is a set of brain regions that activate when you're not focused on the outside world. It's responsible for self-referential thinking, memory consolidation, imagination, and creative problem-solving. Einstein famously had his breakthroughs in the shower, not at his desk, because relaxed, inward-focused states activate this network. Prayer does the same thing, but with intention. When you close your eyes, quiet external stimuli, and enter a reflective state during prayer, you're deliberately activating your DMN. Studies using fMRI scans during prayer and meditation show increased activity in the medial prefrontal cortex, posterior cingulate cortex, and angular gyrus, all core DMN regions. This is why people often report sudden clarity or insight during or after prayer. You're not receiving divine downloads, you're giving your brain's background processing system permission to work. The interesting historical parallel is the Christian practice of lectio divina, slow, meditative reading and prayer over scripture. Practitioners weren't just memorizing verses, they were entering a state that allowed subconscious connections to surface. Modern neuroscience shows that this kind of unfocused, reflective time is when the brain integrates information, makes novel connections, and solves problems that stumped you during active focus. The challenge is that distracted or rushed prayer doesn't activate the DMN. If your mind is on your to-do list, you're still in task-positive network mode, and you lose the creative and integrative benefits. The advantage requires actual disengagement from external demands, which is increasingly rare. These 8 advantages reveal something most people miss about prayer. It's not primarily about getting things from God. It's about the neurological, psychological, and behavioral changes that occur in the person who prays. The autonomic reset, the prefrontal strengthening, the identity reinforcement, the metacognitive development, the temporal distance, the pre-commitment effect, the emotional regulation training, and the default mode activation. All of these are measurable, reproducible mechanisms that don't require belief to function. They work because of how human brains and bodies are structured. Ancient Christians discovered these benefits experientially and built entire spiritual disciplines around them. Modern science is now explaining the mechanisms they intuitively understood. The irony is that these advantages only work when prayer is genuine. The moment it becomes mechanical, performative, or coerced, most of these benefits disappear. You can't trick your nervous system. You can't fake delayed gratification training. You can't perform your way into metacognition. The practice requires what every ancient tradition demanded: sincerity, attention, and regularity. That's the ultimate hidden advantage. Prayer works not because it manipulates God, but because it changes you in ways you can't shortcut. So which advantage shocked you most? Was it the measurable nervous system reset happening in just 5 to 7 minutes? The monks showing thickened gray matter in their self-control regions? Or that prayer activates the same brain state that gave Einstein his biggest breakthroughs? Drop it in the comments. And if you want more scientific breakdowns of ancient practices the modern world dismissed, hit subscribe. Because daily prayer isn't about manipulating God, it's about mechanisms that rewire you, and those mechanisms don't care whether you believe in them or not.